Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to sift through the sources, pull out the key insights.
And really give you the essential knowledge you need, right, to navigate the world.
That's the goal. Today we're doing a pretty deep and maybe unsettling examination.
Yeah, we're looking at how America's perpetual conflicts have kind of evolved over time.
Specifically, we're tracing the history of the wars on crime, drugs, and terror.
And the core idea here, based on the sources, is how these stopped being, separate things and really merged into one big interconnected project, both globally and right here at home.
Right. The sources suggest this wasn't just some accident, this blurring of lines between internal threats and external enemies.
No, it seems it was quite deliberately collapsed through policy choices, the rhetoric used, even how institutions started copying each other.
It's a process tracked over, 6 decades?
About that, yeah. And a really potent example to kick things off is actually from 2011, Operation Neptune's Spear.
The killing of Osama bin Laden.
Exactly. Politically, it was framed as this huge, definitive win, a moment the nation could finally breathe out.
I remember that feeling. But the sources caution it was more complicated than that simple victory narrative.
Definitely. You see it in the campaign messaging afterwards. Vice President Biden, for instance, had that unofficial slogan.
Oh, yeah. Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive.
Right. And that phrase just perfectly ties together the foreign military victory with a sense of domestic economic recovery.
It really captures that idea of aggressive hyperpower, doesn't it? Like America could just forcefully succeed everywhere, inside and out.
It does. But, President Obama himself actually warned folks. He said bin Laden's death wasn't the end of our effort.
So the global war on terror just kept going.
It did, and it expanded. It morphed into these huge surveillance programs, massive law enforcement efforts that just kept chipping away at that line between foreign and domestic.
Okay, so if we want to understand how we ended up here, with, say, local police looking like military units overseas.
Which is something we definitely see.
The sources point to 3 big overlapping historical trends, really starting back in the Cold War era.
Yeah, let's try to unpack those. The first one is, the continuous and growing U.S. involvement in the developing world.
Through interventions, right. Both the ones we knew about and the secret ones.
Exactly, overt and covert.
Yeah.
And these were really driven by a particular view of America's global role.
Okay, what's the second trend?
The second is how much domestic politics shaped foreign policy. Sometimes it seems like domestic concerns were the main driver.
And this idea of aggressive hyperpower, America being the unchallenged top dog.
That became a bipartisan thing, especially after the Soviet Union fell. A lot of the old political checks and balances kind of disappeared.
Makes sense. And the third trend?
This is a really interesting one. It's this constant tension between wanting American primacy, being number one, and this persistent underlying fear of national decline.
That fear pops up again and again, doesn't it? After Vietnam, definitely.
And again after the 2008 financial crisis. Big time.
And the sources argue that things like crime, drug use, they get framed as symptoms of this decline.
Precisely. Which then makes them the perfect justification for using tougher tactics, military-style tactics, both abroad and at home. It sort of justifies the crackdown.
That fear of decline, it almost sounds like the psychological lever that lets leaders treat parts of their own population like a foreign enemy.
That's a really good way to put it. It's like that suspicion gets turned inward.
Okay, so let's dig into those roots of intervention, this concept you mentioned, the war for civilization.
Yeah, during the Cold War, a lot of U.S. policy in the developing world was framed this way. Interventions were often justified by this, paternalistic idea that America knew best.
And sometimes mixed with some pretty ugly ideas about racial or religious inferiority of the local populations.
Unfortunately, yes, the sources indicate that was often part of the mindset. It made intervention seem more acceptable, perhaps.
And President Kennedy had that famous analogy for this role.
The volunteer fire department.
What exactly did he mean by that? What's the implication?
Well, Kennedy's picture was whenever a fire breaks out, somewhere in the world, instability, maybe a communist threat, a revolution.
The U.S. rushes in.
Right. Our firemen rush in, he said, wheeling up all their heavy equipment, using every known method to put out the fire.
And then what?
And then, crucially, they leave the grateful but still stunned inhabitants to clean up the rubble.
Wow. So jump in, use overwhelming force, fix the immediate problem, and don't worry too much about the mess left behind or the long-term consequences.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
And as the sources often point out, sometimes that fire was, shall we say, fanned by Washington's own actions or maybe even started by them.
And the formal basis for this global reach, that was laid down pretty early, wasn't it? NSC Directive 54012.
Yeah, May 1954. President Eisenhower approved it. Yeah. NSC 5412 was huge.
Why was it so significant?
Because it basically gave the thumbs up for global covert operations. It became the guiding star for American black ops for years. It really cemented the CIA's role as not just an intelligence agency, but an active intervention force.
But even back then, people inside the system were raising red flags about this focus on dirty tricks.
Absolutely. There was a really critical report in 1956 by David Bruce and Robert Levitt, Serious Insiders.
And what did they warn about?
They were deeply worried about the CIA leaning so heavily on covert action, psychological warfare, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They called it king-making in the Third World.
King-making.
Yeah. And they argued it was actually hurting the U.S. because it pulled resources and attention away from the core job of just gathering good intelligence.
But those warnings were
Largely ignored. The institutional momentum was already building towards counterinsurgency as the main tool.
Which brings us inevitably to Vietnam, the ultimate counterinsurgency laboratory, in a way.
You could certainly see it that way.
How did the fundamental misunderstanding or maybe denial about the nature of that conflict, calling it an invasion from Hanoi instead of a civil war, how did that shape decisions?
It shaped everything. Because of that denial, the Kennedy and later the Johnson administrations put immense pressure on the military and the CIA. They had to show progress.
They needed that light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly. And to deliver that, when the reality on the ground wasn't matching up, the reporting just got manipulated. Success was essentially fabricated to meet White House demands.
And that pressure, that need for fake success, led straight to one of the most notorious aspects of the war, the body count.
Oh, the body count. Yeah.
What did focusing on that single metric actually incentivize?
It incentivized killing.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. Pentagon officials even admitted it became the only real measure of success in the field.
So the more bodies, the better you were doing, regardless of who those bodies belonged to?
Pretty much. The whole system rewarded commanders who reported high numbers. And crucially, it created this perverse psychological space where it became okay, even encouraged, to blur the lines between civilians and actual enemy combatants.
Just to make the numbers look good for the reports going back to Washington.
Exactly. The dehumanization required for that is, well, it's stark when you read the sources.
They even had acronyms for it.
Yeah. The sources mention MGR stood for the Mere Gook Rule. It was apparently a kind of psychological shorthand, a way to justify abuses against Vietnamese civilians.
That's chilling.
And it led directly to that infamous phrase, the one you hear associated with the worst aspects of the war. If it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC.
Let's pause on that. If it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC. That just eliminates the entire problem of distinguishing combatants from non-combatants.
It's an administrative fix to a moral and tactical nightmare. It basically says, don't bother trying to figure it out, just count them all. It completely dehumanizes an entire population.
And this wasn't just cynical field talk, it became formalized policy, didn't it? Through the Phoenix program, CORDS.
Yes, exactly. The Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, CORDS, which housed the Phoenix program. This was the institutionalization of that idea, treating the population itself as the enemy infrastructure.
What was Phoenix designed to do? And why is it so key for understanding this later shift to domestic stuff?
Phoenix was explicitly designed to neutralize. That was the term, the Viet Cong infrastructure, or VCI.
So not the armed fighters necessarily, but the political organizers, the tax collectors, the sympathizers, the whole civilian network.
Precisely. It targeted South Vietnamese citizens believed to be part of that network. The goal was incredibly ambitious. Identify and eliminate something like 75,000 supposed insurgents and supporters.
How did it actually work in practice? Was it effective, humane?
It was massive, and it was brutal. The methods often involved arbitrary arrest, detention without trial, widespread torture, and summary executions.
So rife with abuse.
Hugely. And it was also deeply corrupt. South Vietnamese officials, police, informants, they often used the program to settle old scores, extort money, or get rid of rivals by simply labeling them VCI. Innocent people got swept up constantly.
And the final tally.
By 1972, the program officially claimed it had met its goal. Over 81,000 Vietnamese had been neutralized, killed, imprisoned, or turned.
81,000 people. Just staggering. A coordinated campaign to basically dismantle a civilian political structure using any means necessary.
That's what it was. And the crucial takeaway, the reason we're spending time on it, is that the Phoenix program, this centralized, data-driven, often brutal effort to eliminate a perceived internal enemy infrastructure, became a kind of template.
A blueprint.
Yeah, a blueprint that policymakers would look back on and try to adapt, not just for other foreign wars, but eventually for tackling problems inside the United States, like crime and drugs.
It's genuinely disturbing to think that something like the Phoenix program, with all its abuses, could be seen as a model for anything, let alone domestic policy.
It is disturbing. But the sources suggest that mindset, that counterinsurgency approach, started seeping into how domestic issues were viewed almost immediately after Vietnam began to wind down. Well, policymakers, they were dealing with the trauma of Vietnam, plus rising anxieties about crime and social unrest at home. They started framing these internal problems, crime, drugs, as if they were existential threats, almost like insurgencies.
And using similar language.
Exactly. Using that same kind of paternalistic language, sometimes tinged with those old notions of inferiority that had been used against foreign populations. The other, inside America, was being framed in a way that wasn't dissimilar to how insurgents were framed overseas.
You can really see this coming to a head with the urban riots in the mid-1960s. Can you remind us about the summer of '67? That was a particularly bad one.
It was explosive.
Yeah.
Massive riots broke out in several cities, but Newark and especially Detroit were just devastating.
What happened in Detroit?
It started with a police raid on an unlicensed after-hours bar, mostly African-American patrons. Tensions were already sky-high over policing and discrimination. Things escalated incredibly quickly, fueled by rumors and misinformation.
And the response?
The Michigan National Guard was called in. Federal troops eventually, too. It became incredibly chaotic and violent. By the time it ended, over 40 people were dead, thousands injured, and huge parts of the city, something like 2,500 buildings, were burned or destroyed.
Just awful. So the government had to react. President Johnson set up the Kerner Commission, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders.
That's right.
What did people expect the commission to find, and what did it actually say?
Well, the conventional wisdom, certainly in the White House and much of Congress, was that they blame outside agitators, communists, maybe black power militants, a few troublemakers.
Sexual suspects.
Right. But the Kerner report, when it came out in February '68, did the opposite. It shocked a lot of people.
Right.
It pointed the finger squarely at systemic issues. It famously warned that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It blamed institutional racism, lack of opportunity, and aggressive policing practices.
Wow. For a presidential commission back then, that's a pretty radical conclusion.
It really was.
And what did the commission say about the police response, the use of force during the riots?
They were incredibly critical of the trend towards police militarization. They saw it as making things worse, not better.
Did they have specific recommendations on that?
They did, and they used really strong language. They explicitly condemned equipping police departments with what they called mass destruction weapons.
Mass destruction weapons? Like what?
They specifically mentioned automatic rifles, machine guns, and tanks. They saw these as tools of war, totally inappropriate for domestic policing.
That's a crystal clear warning against letting the military approach bleed into civilian law enforcement. So what happened? Did Washington listen? Did they stop the flow of military gear?
No, not at all. And this is where the irony just hits you over the head. Less than 6 months after the Kerner Commission delivered that stark warning, Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968.
The Safe Streets Act, I've heard of that.
It authorized a huge injection of federal money, $400 million initially, specifically for local law enforcement agencies to upgrade their capabilities.
Hey, let me guess, what did the local police departments spend that money on?
Military equipment. Within just 2 years, the sources say $40 million worth of actual military hardware surplus gear from the Department of Defense, things like that, was transferred to local police forces across the country.
So the very thing the president's own commission had just condemned arming police like soldiers was immediately funded and accelerated by Congress.
Precisely. The act essentially opened the floodgates for the militarization the Kerner Commission feared. The mechanism for bringing the war home was now federally funded and fully operational.
Meanwhile, while the police are getting M6 Tines and armored vehicles, the intelligence agencies are turning their focus inward too, right? Using the tools they honed overseas against Americans?
Absolutely. The CIA, for example, launched Operation CAOS.
What was CAOS?
It was a large-scale domestic spying program. The CIA illegally monitored anti-war activists, student groups, civil rights organizations,
Yeah.
basically anyone considered subversive.
How extensive was it?
They gathered information on something like 300,000 Americans, and they created detailed files on over 7,000 individuals, all illegally, since the CIA is supposed to operate overseas.
And they kept this information to themselves?
No, that's the other key part. They shared these files directly with the FBI, blurring the lines between foreign intelligence gathering and domestic law enforcement even further.
And it wasn't just the CIA, right? Other agencies were involved in domestic surveillance, too.
Correct. The National Security Agency, the NSA, had Operation Minaret.
What did Minaret do?
It involved intercepting the communications, phone calls, telegrams of U.S. citizens on government watch lists, again, often without warrants. People involved in anti-war protests, civil rights leaders, even members of Congress were targeted.
And the FBI.
Well, the FBI had its infamous COINTELPRO counterintelligence programs. These ran for years, targeting a huge range of groups.
Who was under COINTELPRO?
Oh, everyone from the Communist Party to white supremacist groups like the KKK, but also the New Left, student activists, the anti-war movement, and especially black liberation groups like the Black Panther Party. The goal wasn't just spying, it was disruption, discrediting, neutralization.
It sounds like the entire national security apparatus was being repurposed for domestic control.
That's certainly what the sources suggest. And interestingly, even people within the agency seem to realize they were in murky territory.
How so?
There's a quote in the materials from an internal NSA historian looking back at this period. He wrote, and this is pretty telling, "There is no stark line between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement. The phrases, which appear to be watertight, actually leak into each other at many points."
Wow. Leak into each other. That's a perfect description, a recognition from inside that the separation wasn't real anymore.
Exactly. It shows that this blurring wasn't just theoretical, it was happening institutionally. The foundations for the modern surveillance state, justified by foreign threats but increasingly aimed inward, were really being laid right here in the shadow of Vietnam.
And that leak, as you say, just became a torrent after 9/11. But the tools, the mindset, the legal justifications, the military gear on domestic streets, it all has roots back here.
Which leads us straight into the next phase, where the war on drugs really cements this convergence. It becomes the main vehicle for applying these foreign war tactics domestically, and it gets tied up with that narrative of American decline we talked about.
Right. Richard Nixon comes into office, and law and order is his big message. Why focus so intensely on drugs specifically? Was it just about crime?
Well, the sources suggest it was a very calculated choice for both practical and political reasons.
Okay, practically.
Practically, drug trafficking often crosses state and international borders. That automatically gives the federal government jurisdiction. So launching a war on drugs allowed the White House to assert federal power and presence in communities in ways that just fighting local street crime wouldn't. It expanded federal reach.
Politically.
Politically, it was incredibly useful. Nixon's team, particularly figures like John Ehrlichman, saw drug use as the common denominator, linking all the groups they wanted to rally Middle America, or ignored America, against.
Which groups were those?
Specifically, the sources mention low-income black communities, the hippie counterculture, and the anti-war movement. By declaring war on drugs, they could effectively disrupt and demonize these groups, portraying them not just as criminals, but as threats to the nation's fabric.
So it wasn't just about stopping drug use. It was a political weapon against dissent and specific demographics.
That's the argument presented in the sources, yes. It allowed them to frame political opposition as a dangerous social pathology.
And meanwhile, the actual drugs fueling this crisis, some of them were literally coming from the foreign war zone.
The connection is sometimes shockingly direct and grim. The most famous example is probably Frank Lucas.
The Harlem drug lord portrayed in the movie American Gangster.
That's the one. Lucas set up an incredibly lucrative pipeline for high-purity heroin, shipping it directly from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle, right in the heart of the Vietnam War theater, to the streets of New York.
And the method he claimed to use.
He famously boasted, years later, that he smuggled the heroin back to the U.S. hidden inside the coffins of dead American soldiers being flown home from Vietnam.
Good grief. Whether entirely true or exaggerated, that image alone, using the caskets of fallen soldiers to smuggle heroin, it just perfectly captures a horrifying intersection of the foreign war and the domestic drug crisis.
It really does. It shows how the chaos and corruption spawned by the war directly poisoned American cities.
So faced with this influx, the Nixon administration decided to take the fight abroad, treating drug source countries like new counterinsurgency targets.
Exactly. They launched Operation Intercept in September 1969.
What was Operation Intercept?
It was a massive, sudden crackdown on the U.S.-Mexico border. The idea was to stop marijuana smuggling.
How did they do it?
They basically tried to inspect every single car and truck crossing from Mexico into the U.S. They threw huge numbers of customs agents at the border.
And the result?
Chaos.
Yeah.
Border traffic ground to a halt for weeks. Tourism and commerce between the two countries were paralyzed. Diplomatic relations got incredibly strained, and despite all that disruption,
They didn't find much marijuana.
very little, according to the reports. It was hugely disruptive, but largely ineffective in terms of seizures.
Were there warnings inside the government that this wasn't a good strategy?
Yes, internal analysts quickly flagged it as flawed. They argued it was more about political theater than effective interdiction.
And they also warned about unintended consequences, right?
They did. There was a really prescient warning that focusing so much effort on bulky, low-profit marijuana might actually push traffickers towards more compact, high-value drugs.
Like heroin and cocaine.
Exactly, creating an enforcement vacuum for the harder stuff, which, tragically, is pretty much what happened over the next decade.
Did the U.S. keep pursuing these kinds of militarized anti-drug operations abroad?
Oh yeah, subsequent efforts, like Operation Condor in Mexico, continued the approach. Condor involved using aircraft to spray chemical defoliants herbicides over suspected opium poppy and marijuana fields.
Like Agent Orange in Vietnam, but for drugs.
Similar concept, different chemicals, but the problem was the same. The spraying was often indiscriminate. It destroyed legitimate food crops that peasant farmers relied on, contaminated water sources, and caused serious health problems for the local population. Again, significant collateral damage in the name of the drug war.
Okay, let's jump forward to the 1980s, the Reagan era. This is when the connection between U.S. foreign policy, covert operations, and drug trafficking explodes into a major scandal, Iran-Contra.
Right. The Iran-Contra affair involved the Reagan administration secretly selling arms to Iran, an officially designated state sponsor of terrorism, to get hostages released, and then illegally diverting the profits from those sales to fund the Contras.
The Contras being the right-wing paramilitary groups fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua.
Exactly. And the sources show that in the course of providing this secret, off-the-books support to the Contras, U.S. officials often turned a blind eye to, or even became entangled with, their allies' involvement in the cocaine trade.
The priority was fighting the Sandinistas, not stopping drug flow.
It seems that way. Winning the proxy war in Nicaragua trumped the war on drugs mandate, at least for some involved in the covert operations.
This eventually led to a big Senate investigation led by Senator John Kerry in 1987. What did Kerry's subcommittee find?
They dug deep into this connection. Their final report, though somewhat downplayed at the time, provided substantial evidence that Contra units and suppliers were indeed involved in drug trafficking and that U.S. agencies knew about it.
Did they get specific testimony on CIA knowledge?
They did. One of the most explosive pieces of testimony came from Alan Fears, Jr. He was the chief of the CIA's Central American Task Force at the time.
And what did he admit?
He admitted under oath, specifically talking about one prominent Contra leader, Eden Pastora, known as Comandante Cerro, quote, "We knew that everybody around him was involved in cocaine."
Wow, everybody around him? That's not ambiguous. The CIA knew they were working with major drug traffickers.
That's what Fears' testimony indicates. The geopolitical goal took precedence.
The Kerry report also pointed out the danger of how these covert ops were funded, right?
Yes, it highlighted how the secrecy and reliance on unconventional funding mechanisms made it almost inevitable that drug money would get mixed in. It even revealed that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a key figure in the whole scandal.
From the National Security Council staff.
Right, North had actually proposed taking money seized by the DEA in a drug sting operation and using that money to fund the Contras.
Using drug money to fund a U.S.-backed war.
The DEA apparently rejected that specific idea. But the fact it was even proposed showed, as the report put it, the potential appeal of drug profits for persons engaged in covert activity. It blurred the lines completely.
It suggests the government itself saw drug profits as a potential, off-budget funding stream for its secret wars. That's pretty damning.
It is. And the consequences back home were devastating as cocaine smuggled along these Contra-related routes helped fuel the crack epidemic that ravaged American cities in the 80s.
Was this connection widely reported at the time?
Not really. Not by the major news outlets. But one journalist, Gary Webb, writing for the San Jose Mercury News in the mid-90s, published a series called Dark Alliance.
I remember that series. It caused a huge controversy.
It did. Webb meticulously documented connections between a major California crack dealer, Freeway, Rick Ross, his Nicaraguan suppliers, and the CIA-backed Contras. He built directly on evidence that was already in the public record, including the Kerry Report.
But he faced a massive backlash, didn't he?
It's immense. Major newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, along with the CIA itself, launched a campaign to discredit Webb and his reporting. They picked apart his methodology, accused him of overstating the connections.
Even though the core links were arguably supported by earlier government investigations.
Exactly. The backlash was so intense it effectively ruined Webb's career and largely buried the uncomfortable questions his series raised about the government's potential complicity, even if indirect, in the crack crisis.
So all of this, the fear of crime, the very real drug epidemic, the racialized narratives, it all feeds into creating a specific image of certain parts of America.
Yes, it leads to what the sources term the geographical imaginary of the Badlands.
Explain that term, Badlands.
It's originally a geological term, but it also has military connotations. It describes terrain that is difficult, dangerous, maybe sparsely populated, and crucially inhabited by people considered hostile or uncivilized. A place where normal rules don't apply, where extreme measures are justified.
So urban areas, particularly low-income minority neighborhoods, suffering from crime and disinvestment, places like North Philadelphia mentioned in the sources, they get mentally mapped as these domestic badlands.
That's the idea. This labeling, this geographical framing is incredibly important because once you designate a place and its people as part of the Badlands, you've created the justification to treat it like a foreign war zone.
It legitimizes the use of overwhelming militarized force by police.
Exactly. The language and logic of foreign counterinsurgency fighting in hostile territory against an uncivilized enemy gets imported directly onto American streets. The domestic war now has its own battle map, drawn along lines of race and class.
Which brings us directly to the post-9/11 era, the global war on terror. It feels like this is where all those threads we've been tracing, the foreign intervention tactics, the domestic surveillance, the militarization of policing, the blurring lines, they all just snap together.
That's a very good way to put it. 9/11 provided the catalyst and the ultimate justification to fully merge these different forms of warfare and state power.
And the immediate legal response domestically was the USA Patriot Act, passed incredibly quickly.
Yeah, overwhelmingly quickly, with very little debate, really. And it was massive, over 340 pages long.
What did it actually allow the government to do? What were the key provisions?
It granted sweeping new powers, things like allowing for preventive detention of non-citizens suspected of terrorism links, often indefinitely and without charge. It expanded secret searches.
You mean searching property without notifying the owner immediately?
Exactly. It broadened the government's ability to conduct electronic surveillance wiretaps, accessing emails, financial records, often without needing to show probable cause of a crime, just that it was relevant to a terrorism investigation.
And it authorized those sneak and peek warrants we talked about earlier.
Yes, Section 213 of the Act formally authorized sneak and peek or delayed notification warrants nationwide for any federal crime, not just terrorism.
So police could search your home or office, take photos, even seize things, and not tell you until much later.
That's right. It fundamentally alters that Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure, where you're supposed to be notified when the search happens.
And underpinning this whole expansion of power was a specific legal theory being pushed hard by the White House, particularly Vice President Cheney's office.
Yes, the unitary executive theory.
Explain that theory. Why was it so important in this context?
Basically, the unitary executive theory argues that the Constitution gives the president complete control over the entire executive branch, and that Congress cannot place limits on the president's authority, especially when it comes to national security and wartime powers.
So during war, the president's power is essentially unlimited. Congress can't interfere.
That's the extreme version of the theory they were advancing. It effectively puts the president above the law in wartime.
And Cheney had advocated for this before, hadn't he?
He had. The sources point out he pushed a similar strong view of executive power back during the Iran-Contra investigations, arguing in the Minority Report that Congress had overstepped its bounds in trying to constrain the president's foreign policy actions.
So 9/11 gave him the opportunity to finally put that theory into practice.
It seems so. And this legal philosophy directly enabled some of the most controversial aspects of the war on terror, like the CIA's Enhanced Interrogation Program.
Which is the government's term for torture.
Essentially, yes. The Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, operating under this expansive view of presidential power, issued memos arguing that harsh interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, didn't legally constitute torture, and that even if they did, the president had the authority to order them in wartime.
They also argued the Geneva Conventions didn't apply.
Right. They classified Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters not as prisoners of war, but as illegal enemy combatants, stripping them of protections under international law.
This legal framework led directly to abuses, like the case of Abu Zubaydah.
Abu Zubaydah's case is a truly horrific example. He was captured in Pakistan, believed to be a top al-Qaeda operative, and sent to a secret CIA black site in Thailand.
And subjected to the enhanced interrogation techniques.
Repeatedly and brutally. The official records, later declassified, show he was waterboarded at least 83 times. He was subjected to sleep deprivation, confined in small boxes, slammed against walls.
83 times. And what did they eventually find out about him? Was he the senior leader they thought he was?
No. Years later, after all that, the CIA's own assessment concluded he was never actually a member of al-Qaeda at all. He was likely a mid-level facilitator for other militants, and possibly mentally disturbed before his capture. The torture yielded bad intelligence.
Did the CIA know at the time that these methods weren't reliable?
That's what makes it even worse. The Senate Intelligence Committee's exhaustive report on the program, released years later, found evidence the CIA knew internally that coercive methods were ineffective for getting accurate information.
They knew it produced false confessions.
Their own studies suggested it. The Senate report stated coercive techniques were historically proven to be ineffective and probably resulted in false answers. But the program continued, and the agency often misrepresented its effectiveness to the Justice Department and Congress.
Okay, so alongside the physical coercion, there was this massive expansion of data collection and surveillance, watch lists, databases.
Just an explosion. The government started building enormous databases with very low standards for inclusion. The Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment, TIDE, is a prime example.
How big did TIDE get?
By 2013, it had over 1 million names in it. But because the criteria for getting added were so broad, sometimes just a vague suspicion or association was enough, it became this gigantic haystack. Finding actual terrorists, the needles, became arguably harder, not easier.
Which brings us to that critical data point you mentioned earlier, the one showing how this war on terror machinery got folded into the war on drugs, the sneak and peek warrants.
Yes, this is really telling. Remember, these warrants were justified under the Patriot Act, primarily for catching terrorists in complex plots, where immediate notifications might tip them off.
Right, so how were they actually used?
An analysis looked at their use in 1 year, 2013. Out of nearly 9,500 sneak and peek warrants approved.
How many were for terrorism cases?
Only 51.
51, out of almost 9,500.
Exactly. The overwhelming majority, over 9,400 of them, were used in ordinary criminal investigations, mostly narcotics cases.
That's astounding. So this extraordinary power, granted in the name of fighting al-Qaeda, became a routine tool for busting drug dealers.
It shows a complete institutional bleed-over. The powerful, secretive tools created for counterterrorism were eagerly adopted by domestic law enforcement for the ongoing war on drugs. The legal thresholds were lower, the secrecy appealing. The two wars effectively merged at the operational level.
And then they merged legally, too, with the narco-terrorism statute. How did the government sell this explicit link to the public?
Very aggressively. The Bush administration launched major PR campaigns. You might remember those Super Bowl ads.
Vaguely, yeah.
The message was blunt. Drug money supports terror. And another tagline was, if you buy drugs, you might too. They wanted to directly link buying street drugs in America to funding terrorism abroad.
Creating a moral panic, essentially.
And providing justification for expanding enforcement powers. The narco-terrorism statute itself was written very broadly.
How so?
It allowed the U.S. to charge individuals with providing material support to terrorist organizations, even if the drug trafficking they were involved in occurred entirely outside the U.S. and the drugs weren't destined for American shores.
So it gave the U.S. global jurisdiction over drug crimes if they could somehow link the players to a designated terrorist group.
Pretty much. It framed drug trafficking anywhere in the world as a potential U.S. national security threat.
And we see this applied in cases like Khan Mohammed's.
Exactly. Khan Mohammed was an Afghan linked to the Taliban who was involved in the heroin trade. He was prosecuted under this statute. An informant even quoted him, saying that selling opium and heroin to the West, particularly America, was a form of jihad against the infidels.
So the narco-terrorism concept became a reality used by both sides.
It became a self-reinforcing loop.
And finally, all this militarization, the equipment, the mindset, the tactics, comes home to roost in everyday policing through SWAT teams.
The rise of SWAT teams is just dramatic. They existed before, but their use exploded. The sources cite a 1,400% increase in the number of SWAT teams between 1980 and 2000 before 9/11.
1,400%.
Yeah. And after 9/11, with even more federal funding and surplus military gear available, it accelerated further. These teams, originally intended for rare, extreme situations like hostage rescues or active shooters, started being used routinely for drug raids, serving warrants.
Bringing military tactics into regular policing.
Breaking down doors, using flashbang grenades, wearing military camouflage, carrying assault rifles. And the visual culmination of all this, the moment where the convergence became undeniable for many Americans, was Ferguson, Missouri in 2014.
After the police killing of Michael Brown.
The images coming out of Ferguson during the protests were shocking. Local police deployed in armored personnel carriers, wearing combat gear, pointing sniper rifles at protesters. It looked like an occupying army.
I remember Representative Emmanuel Cleaver's comment.
Yes, he famously said that Ferguson looked like Fallujah, the city in Iraq that saw intense urban combat. That comparison just perfectly captured it. The battlefield abroad and the streets at home had visually, tactically, and psychologically merged.
#tag outro.
So if we pull back and look at this whole arc, this deep dive through 6 decades, the picture that emerges from the sources is pretty clear, isn't it?
It seems to be, yeah. This idea of securing civilization, whether against communism or crime or drugs or terror, has been used repeatedly to justify policies that have, well, institutionalized conflict and consistently racialized threats, whether abroad or at home.
Right. And systematically militarized domestic law enforcement, step by step.
The sources also seem to stress that the big interventions driving these trends often failed on their own terms, didn't they?
Repeatedly. Vietnam, the counterinsurgency efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, even interventions like Somalia. The evidence suggests military force didn't solve the underlying political or social problems.
And even supposed successes are questioned, like Plan Colombia.
Yeah, Plan Colombia was often held up as a model for counter-narcotics and counterinsurgency. But the sources point out that after the big cartels were taken down, coca cultivation actually increased as smaller, more dispersed groups filled the vacuum. The narrative of success didn't always match the reality.
So why does the cycle continue? If the interventions often fail, why keep replicating the model?
Well, one argument suggested by the sources is that the vast apparatus built to wage these wars, the huge military budget, the sprawling intelligence agencies, the defense contractors, the surveillance systems, it develops its own inertia. It needs a perpetual threat to justify its existence and its ever-growing budget.
So the surveillance continues, the databases grow, not necessarily because they're the most effective way to ensure safety, but because they sustain the architecture of the war itself and the power that comes with it.
That's a central argument running through this analysis. It becomes self-perpetuating.
The final point the sources leave us with is this really stark contrast, isn't it?
It is. It's quite devastating when you think about it. We've spent trillions of dollars since 2001 building this immense global military and intelligence machine to fight the war on terror.
Trillions.
Yet the initial attack that started it all, 9/11, was carried out by 19 hijackers armed with, essentially, box cutters.
So what does that massive disconnect suggest between the initial threat and the scale of the response?
It strongly suggests, according to this analysis, that the path taken, the massive global militarized war for civilization, both overseas and increasingly at home, was perhaps more of a political and ideological choice than a purely pragmatic security necessity.
A choice for massive, visible, forceful action rather than maybe more focused, less militarized measures.
Exactly. The sources imply that a fraction of the resources poured into wars and occupations could potentially have achieved better security outcomes if invested differently. Things like, really improving human intelligence cooperation, drastically enhancing physical security for airlines and critical infrastructure, maybe addressing some of the root causes of extremism, and perhaps tackling the domestic social issues and fears that make these war narratives so politically potent.
Instead, we're left with this legacy. A state deeply entrenched in perpetual conflict, both abroad and, increasingly, against its own citizens, blurring the lines until Ferguson looks like Fallujah.
That seems to be the enduring, troubling outcome of merging these wars. A state constantly finding new enemies, both foreign and domestic, to justify the machinery of conflict itself.